Yes, I'm just going to do a quick live hangout. I've entitled this live hangout, Canadian Baptist Minister Denies the Resurrection. I came across this sermon because someone sent me an email, and I fear that I need this sermon is going to be put offline soon. So I wanted to capture where it came from and what the person said. Again, to have a Canadian Baptist minister get in the pulpit and deny the resurrection like he does in this sermon is very troubling, and it should be troubling to every Christian in Canada, specifically Canadian Baptists. So I'm going to take you to the website. So this is Burlington Baptist Church in near Toronto, Canada. You can see it. Welcome to Burlington Baptist Church. They're on 2225 New Street, Burlington, Ontario. And this is their sermon entitled The Bible in the 21st Century, preached on January 29th, 2017. So I've skipped, this is the full service. I've skipped the first part, and I'm going to play the sermon at the start.
The flesh or will of man, but of God himself. For the past several years, I, along with Terry Dempsey, have been facilitating an adult study class on Tuesday afternoons. This morning, I want to talk about some of the things we have learned in the class, in particular how the Bible is perceived and understood by current biblical scholars in the theological schools and departments of religion here in the universities in North America and in Europe. Let me say first that the men and women engaged in this work spend much time in their attempts to understand both the context and the meaning of the various texts comprising the Bible, as well as that of the non-canonical and other related texts. They do so, and this is very important to stress, not to try to disparage the Judeo-Christian religion or the Bible, but rather to establish the best text for the various books, as well as to provide some insight, context, and background to the text, with a view to enhancing its understanding. They deal with the text in any way that the evidence leads them. They test ideas, they do a great deal of research, they consult with colleagues. Always their aim is to ferret out the truth. And I, for one, greatly appreciate their dedication as well as the fruits of their dedicated scholarship. And I might add that biblical scholars are not in the business of creating fake news or of propagating alternative facts. It is important to remember that the Bible was a very different world from that of our own. Not physically, but intellectually and socially. It was a spirit-filled world, inhabited by gods and goddesses, good spirits and bad spirits, full of magic and superstition. The great majority of its inhabitants were very poor and illiterate. In this short time, I, of course, can only cover a few points related to the scholar's work. But first, I want to make a few comments about our current social environment in which we find ourselves. I guess it's an overused expression to say that we live in times of rapid technological change that have affected nearly every aspect of our lives, from the forms of communication such as the internet, cell phones, Facebook, Twitter, television, and film, as well as the modes of travel that have created a single global community. Religion has also undergone great change. In Europe and North America, the expansion of church attendance in the first half of the 20th century and after the Second World War ended decades ago, and church attendance has declined ever since in both regions. In the mainline denominations of Canada and the United States, the decline in church attendance has been significant, particularly among young adults. Along with the decline, there is a growing illiteracy throughout society with respect to the Bible, the most important book in the foundation of Western civilization. In his recent book, The End of White Christian America, Robert Jones notes that 20% of Americans today consider themselves religiously unaffiliated, many of whom are young adults who are less than half as likely as seniors to identify with a church. Jones goes on to say that this rejection of organized religion by youth is a major force of change in the religious landscape, and that there is no sign that this pattern will fade anytime soon. Even the evangelical churches are not immune from these trends. In fact, says Jones, their rate of decline in numbers is sharper and steeper than that which happened in the mainline churches, although their overall attendance is still higher than that of the mainline churches. Congregations in most mainline churches today are largely populated by seniors, and their numbers as a percentage of church attendees will continue to grow. The Bible has not escaped being affected by the changes in those societies that once revered it on both sides of the Atlantic. While it is still the most studied book in the West and the most published book, not to mention the number of books written about it, it is read today by only a small percentage of the population, and even that is only on an occasional basis. There was a time in the past on both continents when the scientific and historical accuracy of the Bible was accepted without question. It was necessary to prove that the Bible was wrong. Not anymore. That view ended a long time ago. Now you have to prove that the Bible is correct, for it is no longer assumed to be either scientifically or historically accurate. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Among contemporary scholars, the Bible is generally studied with the same perspective they employ when they study other ancient literature. It is not viewed as an especially inspired book, but principally as a library of ancient texts whose authorship spans several thousand years of history, but whose contents shed light on the social, cultural, and religious environment at different time periods in ancient history. As noted earlier, their objective is to understand the various texts in the context of the times in which they were written. And to that end, they employ all the tools of modern science, including things like archaeology, historical research, language and linguistics, ethnology, social and cultural anthropology, and so on. It should be noted, strictly speaking, that the Bible is not a book, although it exists in book form today. It actually is a small library. And there are also a number of different Bibles. The Protestant Bible has 66 books, the Roman Catholic 73, and the Orthodox 77. And there are other denominations that had even more books. The Bible did not exist in book form until the invention of the printing press in the 15th century by Gutenberg. Prior to that, the various texts existed in manuscript form only, and if new copies were needed, they had to be copied by hand in the various monasteries that held them. The result, over the centuries, was the introduction of tens of thousands of errors into the various texts. Some of those are significant, and some are not so much. And of course, also produced a multitude of manuscripts with textual variations. To deal with this enormous variation in the biblical text, scholars have produced a version in the original languages that includes a version that has all of the various variants in the text. So it is that text that translators use when they're producing a new translation of whatever book they're working on. However, at times when they're confronted with a variant in the text, the translators are forced to make a judgment as to what they believe to be the variant that's closest to the original text. And of course, we don't have any of the original text. The scientific scrutiny of the Bible over the past centuries has resulted in many former views being overturned. For example, the first chapters of Genesis are now classified as stories of origin, not history. In that vein, the flood story and the creation stories, which were likely composed during the exile in Babylon, are now considered as a retelling of Babylonian stories or myths. Further, an account that you have in Joshua 10:13, where Joshua stands with his arms in the air, stopping the sun from moving, of course, is not history. It reflects an Earth-centered universe where the sun revolved around the Earth. Oddly, there is no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. The story appears to weave together memories of the expulsion from Egypt of a Semitic people called the Hyksos in the 2nd millennium BCE, along with an account of conflicts that Israel had with Egypt in the 7th century BCE. And those are separated by anywhere from 700 to 1,000 years. The sagas of the patriarchs follow a similar pattern, with much doubt being cast on their historicity. The many anachronisms in the patriarchal stories indicate that they were composed during the monarchical period, many centuries after the events related in the stories were supposed to have occurred. And all efforts so far to establish their historicity have failed. As mentioned, the creation stories are no longer viewed as plausible accounts of how the earth and all its creatures came into being. Rather, the stories reflect the prevailing view of the ancient world, which was an Earth-centered 3-story universe that was just a few thousand years old. We now know that the history of our planet spans some 4.5 billion years, with life evolving during about half that time. The efforts of creationists to retain a literal reading of the creation story by promulgating the concept of a 6,000-year-old planet are, in my view, entirely futile and serve only to discredit the church. Even the effort by some Christians to relate the 6 days of creation to geological ages is quite futile as well, for it is a false analogy. Many of the geological ages are marked not by creation events, but by catastrophic ones. For example, at the end of the Permian period, 230 million years ago, 90 to 95% of all life on Earth went extinct. The Cretaceous period ended 75 million years ago when an asteroid slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and wiped out the dinosaurs. Over geological time, there have been 5 major extinctions and a number of minor ones. These are accepted scientific facts that are unlikely to be overturned and need, in my view, to be incorporated by Christians into the development of a new creation story. In my view, we can value the Genesis creation story not only as a poetical account of how things came to be, but also one that asserts that intelligence lies behind the universe. I'd like now to turn to several examples where an appreciation of the context is important in understanding the text. In Leviticus 19:19, it reads, "You are not to sow two kinds of grain in your field. You are not to wear a garment made from two kinds of fabric. So what lies behind these prohibitions? The answer lies in the concept of natural law that prevailed in the ancient world. It was believed that if two grains were intended to grow together, or two fabrics like wool and cotton were to be combined, God would have made it so. Since that wasn't the situation in nature, then to put them together would contravene God's law. It's the same concept of natural law that proscribed homosexual relationships, although the penalty was much more severe, death. Another passage where context is important is Leviticus 17:12, where it reads, "None of you or any stranger living among you shall eat blood." It was believed that life existed in the blood, and since blood was given to God as an atonement for sin, it belonged to God, and therefore was not to be eaten. In the Cain and Abel story, after Abel is murdered, God says to Cain, "Listen to the sound of your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground." See, Abel's life was in his blood. Jehovah's Witnesses, as you know, equate blood transfusion with eating blood. Turning to the New Testament, appreciation of context is also important. Both Jesus and Paul believed that the world would end during their lifetimes. It didn't, of course, or we wouldn't be here. During the first century, apocalyptic expectations in Israel were rampant, and therefore it is not surprising that both Jesus and Paul were influenced by such thinking. After all, the nation was suffering under a very harsh Roman administration, and it longed to be free of the Roman yoke. Context is also important considering such cherished Christian doctrines as the virgin birth, the miracles of Jesus and his disciples, and the resurrection of Jesus. While these doctrines may present difficulties for people living in the scientific age that exists today, they did not pose a problem in the first century Christians. In the Greco-Roman world of the first century, the nature of your birth was determined by the product of your lives. In other words, what you accomplished during your life. Persons who became great leaders, great generals, or whatever, were deemed to have had a divine birth. For example, Augustus Caesar, the first emperor, was proclaimed as being divine. His mother claimed that she had been impregnated by the god Apollo in the form of a snake when she spent a night in his temple. Given Jesus' status in the early church, it was not difficult to attribute a divine birth to him, as portrayed particularly in the Gospel of Luke. Time doesn't permit me to discuss the miracles and the resurrection. That would require another sermon, other than to say that contemporary scholars don't take these accounts literally. So what are we to make of all of this in the context of our times? Church attendance is declining rapidly. Congregations are aging. Youth is rejecting organized religion in large numbers, and biblical illiteracy is widespread. Modern biblical scholarship, while it has greatly increased our understanding of the biblical text, it has, for many Christians, taken away the wonder and mystery that they've always associated with the Bible. So do we stick with the traditional biblical views or embrace the new scholarship and work at developing a new form of spirituality? So what can we do? Well, one option is that we don't have to do anything. If we're comfortable with where we are, we just carry on and see what happens. We can retain our traditional biblical perspectives and church practices and hope for the best. I'm not sure, though, that would arrest our decline in numbers in terms of our church membership. We could perhaps modify our service and make it more contemporary and hope that would make it more attractive. However, I don't see the reversing the decline in church attendance, since the population pool from which we would need to draw new members has, for the most part, rejected organized religion. I doubt that modifying our traditional service would be very attractive to them. So what can we do? In my view, I believe we need to change the substance of what we do, including embracing the fruits of modern scholarship. If we want to try to attract the youth generation, we have to be seen as being up to date theologically, as well as dealing with the contemporary issues that are of concern to them. For example, several weeks ago when I was in Vancouver, there was a news item on the radio about a group of young people who were suing the US government for its support of the oil and gas industry. The suit claimed that such support was impacting the present and future quality of their lives due to the effects of climate change. The lawsuit was allowed to proceed and will be heard next summer. Youth are deeply concerned about environmental issues. They're also concerned about poverty and the growing inequality gap, the lack of stable employment, violence in schools, drug and alcohol addiction, homelessness, and so on. They're also interested in newer forms of spirituality. It goes without saying that we face considerable challenges, and there are no easy answers. All options carry risks, and there's no guarantee of success. However, when we do decide on a plan for where we believe that we should go, we need to step forward in faith that a better future awaits us. I find comfort and encouragement in the words of this old hymn. We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind by notions of our day and sect, crude, partial, and confined. No, let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord has yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. Amen.
So there you have it. There you have it. The sermon preached at Burlington Baptist Church on January 29th, 2017, preached by the interim minister, Reverend Bert Radford. A couple of things are pretty bizarre about that sermon. The fact that he just completely wipes out all scientific evidence of the Bible is very troubling. But he says some things that are quite shocking. He flat out says that he doesn't want to speak about the miracles, but he will say that basically modern scholarship, which is not entirely true, not all biblical scholars deny the resurrection, but he says they do, and therefore we're led to believe that he doesn't believe in the resurrection. He suggests in throwing out traditional Christianity completely, and he suggests that we come up and change the substance of our message to suit the needs of the millennials. And he says something very bizarre at the end. We need to step out in faith. Step out in faith in whom? Because he's basically denied Jesus Christ is God and Lord if you don't believe in the miracles of the resurrection. Anyways, just thought that I needed to get this out there before it was deleted. Thanks for watching.